Awesome. Well, thanks again for inviting us to present to your network. Emily and I are really excited to share a little bit more about our evaluation today. We wanted to start off, and I know we've already introduced ourselves a little bit, but we thought we'd give you a little context of our roles within FACnet. So I've been working with FACnet since 2013 when we launched it, and I've had a variety of different roles in the network since then, but I'm currently the director of the network, but what I spend most of my time actually doing is working with members. So we have a system within FACnet called the liaising system, where all of our core members are assigned a staff person whose job is to really understand their work and get to know them and make sure that we're weaving them in with our other network members. And so that's what probably my favorite part of my job. And I'll let Emily introduce herself.
Thanks, Michelle. I am the FACnet Associate Director. I've been with FACnet for almost 6 years next month. And like Michelle, one of my favorite parts of my job is actually working directly with the members themselves. On top of our core network members, we also have affiliate members. So I also specifically manage our affiliate member program, which has slightly different opportunities and values for those specific set of members. And then I help with our network communications and some of our outward facing materials as well, like our blog and our social media. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Emily. So FACnet was, like I just mentioned, started in 2013. It was launched as kind of a sister network to a network called the Fire Learning Network, which had been around since 2002 and was a project that the Nature Conservancy had run. But the Fire Learning Network was focused mainly just on the relationships or just not actually on relationships. It was focused on the landscape. It was focused on the ecology of fire and trying to bring fire back to places that didn't have enough fire and manage fire in different ways where there was too much or the wrong kind of fire. And so in 2013, there was a new national push to rethink how our country was managing fire. And the Watershed Center, which is the organization that both Emily and I work for, which was a place-based nonprofit in Northern California, we were invited to work with the Nature Conservancy to actually start a network that would be more focused on the social aspects of fire and that would kind of try to come into our fire issues from more of a community angle. And so we started FACnet to really look more broadly at both the ecological impacts of fire as well as the social and economic impacts of fire and the ways that fire culture could be different. So when we started FACnet, we had 8 communities. It was really small. We just wanted to kind of test the waters and see if people were interested in this kind of way of working. And since then, we have grown to have a lot more members. We have about 24 core member communities, and we work with between 2 and 3 people in each of those communities to really engage and share in all of the opportunities that we provide. And then Emily has a huge network of 150 individuals in the affiliate program. And then we also support about a half a dozen state networks that are kind of mirroring our national network approach, but really trying to densify engagement within their states. The network, FACnet is just a part of kind of a suite of strategies that are looking at how we can improve community and landscape resilience to wildfire. And so the network isn't the end goal unto itself. It's kind of a pathway that we're trying to use to help change our fire management system from one that is centralized and national to something that's a lot more localized and responsive to different conditions. As someone noted in our introductions, you know, there are very different fire issues in different places. And so what we try to do is help listen to the community leaders about what their assets and problems and opportunities really are and help them shape strategies that will help move towards something that's more resilient and more sustainable way to interact and live with fire. So as you had just heard, we're trying to do something really complex. You all are trying to do something really complex and dynamic as well. So I'm sure you'll all appreciate that. And we're working on this long-term kind of trajectory change. So measurement and evaluation can be really challenging in that context. And, you know, we had so many things we could have chosen to actually look at to evaluate. So we did want to look at some internal information. We wanted to understand if we should adjust the way we were running the network. We wanted to make sure that We had information that could help us net weave those members. We wanted to have opportunities to celebrate successes and to really get a better view of what our collective impact had been over the last 5 years that we were conducted. That was the timeline for the evaluation we conducted. But we also wanted to have some external information to share. We wanted to be able to communicate with current potential funders, with other network members, and also to support those state networks that I was mentioning before, who were also interested in thinking about designing and working on evaluations themselves. So for the focus of this evaluation, like I said, we could have looked at all kinds of different aspects of fire adaptation, but we really decided to try to focus on looking at the efficacy of the network itself as a vehicle for change and how well it was supporting members. So we used this framework. When we very first started thinking about doing an evaluation, Emily was actually the one who was like, hey, I think maybe we should think about evaluation. Like, it's a thing. It's probably going to be really good to do. And she bought a couple of books about evaluating networks. And we had the opportunity to reach out to some other folks we knew who run networks of different sizes and on different topics. And so we just sort of started researching, how are other people approaching evaluation. And we were particularly taken with this framework that's up on your screen that was developed by Network Impact and the Center for Evaluation Innovation. Because, like I mentioned, FACNet's both a result itself and a process to get other results. We knew we needed to kind of get a robust evaluation together, but we also had fairly limited resources, and our funders weren't the ones who were asking us to do this evaluation. So we had kind of a wide open venue to kind of think about for ourselves as staff and for network members, what would really be the most useful information we could gather to shape what we were doing. So we landed on using this framework to gather some insights into the network and to better understand what we were really achieving. So it was sort of our formal evaluation effort, and it had a full design process and took us over a year to conduct. But we also conduct a lot of more informal network member feedback as part of our regular practice. You won't come to a FACnet workshop or event without getting an evaluation on the back end of it. And so we had a lot of other data that we had been using to kind of fine tune the dials of our operations throughout the whole operation of our network. So this was sort of a deeper dive into all of that and a more specific focused effort. So I'm going to hand it over to Emily now, who's going to talk about connectivity as the first portion of our evaluation.
Thanks so much, Michelle. So we are going to try to do a little bit of a dive into each of these different parts while still saving time for questions. So it's going to be a little speedy, but want to give a quick overview of the social network analysis part, which is the connectivity pillar of our evaluation. So we really wanted to seek to answer the questions such as who is connecting to whom, how strongly are they connected? And network connectivity is often evaluated using a social network analysis framework. So that's what we decided to use. We've actually done it twice, once in 2016 and once again in 2018. And for this second social network analysis, we evaluated depth of connection, frequency of connection, and level of influence that members had on each other in the network. If you're not familiar with an SNA, there's kind of basically two parts to it. The first part is a matrix that each member fills out, and they're asked to evaluate each other member on how connected they are to somebody on a scale of 0 to 3 for the different factors that you're looking at. We also asked for their primary method of communication so we could see how people were connecting. And then the map that you see up on your screen here is an example of the end result after the data has been collected and processed. Next slide, Michelle. So in a social change network like FACnet, one goal is to create strong relationships that would facilitate peer learning and idea exchange. So structurally, what that might look like is a strong core with lots of people with strong bonds and a healthy periphery, so lots of additional ties and loose bonds where new members, maybe on more of the outside of the network, are bringing in those new ideas to keep the network innovative and healthy. And so in theory, over time, you would see connections among members strengthen, and newer or more loosely connected members kind of on the outside or the periphery of the network. And you would want to actively cultivate and weave those people into the system over time. So we wanted a way to visualize that because it really helps illustrate our theory of change of even using a network approach in the first place. So what you're seeing up on your screen here is two independent SNA maps, which you can see structurally look really different. In 2018, you see a really dense core for these strong relationships, which indicates kind of more closer relationships than what's on the periphery. These aren't labeled, but it's important to note that on the staff maps that we had, we actually could see the labels. And so we use this as a tool internally to actually, like Michelle was saying, figure out who needs to be net weaved within the network. One cool thing I'll just mention really quickly is that when you actually pulled out the specific members that were part of the network in 2016 and 2018, we actually saw that people that were still in the network after 2 years had stronger and more close relationships with people in the network. Seems obvious, seems like that should be what would happen, but it was really nice to have that data that kind of illustrated that this was happening over time. Next slide. So really quickly, our process, we did work with a consultant who was an expert in social network analysis. The staff did have a role to play. We helped collect the data, helped refine the questions we wanted to ask, and the variables that we wanted to look at with the consultant, but the consultant really did the hard work for us in terms of processing and analyzing the data and then giving us the maps and results. And that worked really well for us since none of our staff were experts in visualization. Next slide, Michelle. So in the chat box, I put a link to the blog, and we wrote this last year, but it really does go over the findings more in depth. We don't have time to go into all of them today, so I'm going to just highlight two major ones. One on this slide just talks about that internal use of this data. So this social network analysis really provided useful data to our net weavers. And so when I got some of these maps and I looked at the different members I worked with, I could see is our Pacific Northwest cluster really tightly connected, but not super connected to the East Coasters, and use that to figure out how we might be able to connect more people and catalyze new connections across the network. So more informed net weaving has resulted in both increased connectivity and just transfer of practices, tools, and ideas between members as well. And this picture on the right-hand side is just looking at some of those different variables that we were able to kind of sort the maps by. Next slide. And then lastly, one of the major things that we were excited about in this 2018 SNA is that close relationships really did result in high levels of influence in the network, which again, seems kind of obvious, but it was really nice to have that data to back up our theory of change. In 2016, we actually measured potential for collaboration, and we decided to change that in 2018 because our network members don't actually really collaborate on projects, but what they do is they learn from each other and they take that learning back and implement it in their own places. And so we decided to look at level of influence instead in 2018 to kind of test that theory and give us insight into who was kind of testing new ideas and experimenting across the network based on the relationships that they were making. So depth of relationships was closely correlated to level of influence, which was an important foundation in FACNet's theory of change. And the 2018 backed that up, showed high correlation between connection and influence. And so to me, that finding really spoke to why we wanted to look at network connectivity besides the pretty maps. So I'll turn it over to Michelle.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Emily. So I'm going to talk about the second two pillars. So if you remember back to that slide, we wanted to look at connectivity, health, and results as part of our overall evaluation. So in terms of deciding how we were going to understand network health, we determined that a scorecard would help us understand that. That's a kind of a typical, again, like SNA is typical for looking at connection, a scorecard is a really typical way of being able to gather data from members about the health of the network itself. So we looked at a number of different scorecards that other networks had made, and we decided that we really wanted to make our scorecard anonymous. As I had mentioned previously, we do a lot of just informal feedback, but lots of that is really tied to that person. So we know who's giving that feedback. And we thought it was really critical in this formal evaluation process to make sure that we were kind of not just hearing the good things and having people just want to be nice to us, but rather making space to really hear if there were critiques or things that people wanted to offer anonymously. So that was an important part of the scorecard we developed. We also really wanted to design the scorecard in a way that would help us get some quantitative data. We have a lot of qualitative data in our network. We do a lot of storytelling. We do a lot of gathering of information that's really qualitative. And so using a scorecard method, we could actually get some quantitative data. So how did we do the scorecard? What we did is we took a series of steps, and I'm going to go through them one by one just to give you all a sense of what that really took. And then I'll also go over the resources that it took to actually conduct the scorecard. So as I said, we reviewed several different samples and kind of picked out some of our favorite questions. We really thought through the fact that FACNet's trying to be valuable both to the individual members as well as their organizations and communities. So as someone mentioned earlier in our introductions, we really do have a really multi-scalar theory of change as well. So we wanted to design questions that would assist us in understanding value across scales. We consulted with some evaluators. The same gentleman who assisted us with the social network analysis also helped review our scorecard and helped us just think through it a little bit. We developed our scorecard then. Emily and I did most of the work on that. And then we used SurveyMonkey, which is a platform that our members are very used to and is something we typically use to launch that scorecard. And then we had to interpret the results and, of course, share those results with our network members and others. Anytime we gather information from our members, we try to tell them what we've learned so that people don't feel like we just ask them questions that then went off into Never Never Land. So what did it really take to do the scorecard? This is probably the easiest part of our evaluation overall. Emily and I spent, a fair amount of time thinking through it, but it was not really resource intensive. We did need some network friends to help give us some examples, give us a little bit of advice. Again, we just called on people we knew who had conducted these types of evaluations. It took our staff time. Again, we called on that same consultant and just asked him to give us 1 or 2 hours of time to kind of review our overall plan and help us think through some specific order of questions and things of that nature. And then we needed SurveyMonkey or some platform for collecting that information. And we needed members to answer the questions. We did get a pretty good response. We typically get 100% response to things where we know who's answering us, because we then do follow up and make sure everyone finishes it. But I think for our health scorecard, we had in the 80% respondents. So it was still a pretty high respondent rate for us not being able to remind people. And then we had to develop a plan for sharing those results. So what did we find from our scorecard? We learned a lot of things in general, much as Emily said with connectivity. What we found really just mirrored what we already thought we knew. So a lot of the findings were just generally validating of what members' values were from the network and what kinds of outcomes they were achieving. But we did flag a few areas for additional investment. In particular, we learned that some members needed a little bit more internal support in their own organizations for participating in the network. And so we realized that we needed to give them some more tools that helped explain the value to their bosses, for example, and helped make sure that they could continue participating. So we learned some things like that I think really helped us understand ways that we could support our members and continuing to engage. Now I'm going to move on to the last part of our evaluation, which was the results. So this is a thing we knew was going to be really challenging to measure. If you remember back to the purpose of FACnet, we're trying to basically change fire management across the US. So that's a pretty big thing to do. And we knew we weren't going to be able to do like a longitudinal study of what was happening in all of our member communities over all the time we'd been engaged with them. And so we decided to really focus this piece of the evaluation with just a cohort of our members. And we had heard about a process called ripple effects mapping from one of our state networks, actually. And that state network, they had been connected to the Washington Extension Agency through the Washington State Extension folks who had developed this ripple effects mapping process. And so we thought, well, let's try this out and see what we can learn from doing this process. So I'll tell you a little bit about what that is now. So ripple effects mapping is basically a group storytelling effort where the cohort that's together on giant pieces of paper on the wall or through mind mapping software identifies a specific event. And that's kind of the pebble dropping into the water if you think about the ripple effects flowing out of a pebble dropping in. So they identify some very specific instances where there was where members had influenced each other or affected each other, and then they build on the ripples of that event. So a pebble might be the time when someone got invited to come speak in another community, and then what the results of that that person coming to speak were. Or maybe someone learned about a smoke management program and then took that home and started adopting and evaluating how to use that in their own place. So that's the kind of general idea of ripple effects mapping. So what we ended up doing for this was working with a consultant. We selected a cohort of our network that had already been engaged together. We planned an in-person 2-day workshop for this, collecting this data. And on the first day, all we did was talk about all this work that each other had been doing and the ways that it had been influencing each other. We had this giant spider web butcher paper map covered in ideas and content that people had shared. And then the evaluators actually took that and overnight tried to evaluate it for us and then provide some results the next day. And it proved far more complicated than I think they had anticipated. And so one thing I would say, if you're going to do this ripple effects mapping, give yourself plenty of time. And I think it actually would work better for smaller groups who've had shared work. What we were doing was like talking about work that really was spin-off work, and it became really complicated to evaluate. But we did review the preliminary results with the cohort and the consultants. And then in terms of resources that took, you definitely need an experienced facilitator to help guide these conversations. I wouldn't say you necessarily need an expert in ripple effects mapping, but you need an experienced facilitator. It was really helpful, I think, to do this in person. I'm not sure how easy this would be to do remotely because it's really based on building off of each other's ideas. And so it really helps, I think, to be in the same room if you can swing it. And then mind mapping software can help translate those sort of butcher paper maps into something that can be made more meaningful and useful in the interpretation phase. And then you need evaluator support, or you need some capability to draw out the findings from those stories. So what did we learn from ripple effects mapping? One thing I did want to mention is that we did see some really awesome additional benefits of ripple effects mapping, because so often in our networks, members are there at the moment of the pebble dropping in, but they don't know anything about what radiates out from that. And so one of the very coolest things that happened was that people really got to see that they had been able to influence what was actually happening on the ground in communities across the Pacific Northwest. And I think that really helped build community among our participants and helped them keep motivated to share with each other. Sometimes we can't do what we want in our own community, but we can get there in another place by influencing them. So now I'm going to let Emily talk really quickly about our advice to others who might want to be doing an evaluation.
Great. Thanks, Michelle. So I'm just going to wrap this up really quickly. Next slide. So if you're thinking about doing it, do it. It was great. We got a lot out of it, both as network staff, but also our network members got a lot out of it. But our caution would be to be really clear about what you're evaluating. So like I said before in that example, when we were looking at collaboration versus influence between 2016 and 2018, just be really clear about what you're trying to understand and figure out the methods that'll help get you to those answers. Next slide. So be realistic about the level of investment that your evaluation will require. Like Michelle said, we did this kind of over a whole year, and it involved preparation, communication with our network members about what and why we were doing it, collection of the data, analysis of the data, reporting, and then actually using and implementing the data. So this was a huge process. It took a lot of work, but we set aside the staff time to do that and made it a priority for that year. And we'll definitely do it again in the future. Next slide. And then lastly, one of the most important things is to just make sure you share back out your results with your network members. we did this in a couple ways. In that blog, we held a webinar specifically for our members. We could talk about kind of that internal network stuff and how we were going to amend things based on their feedback, or how we were going to keep doing things they said was going really well. And we also included this in our annual report, which really went to our funders and our partners. Next. And lastly, this presentation today really just focused on our evaluation, but FACnet has a ton of great content on fire adaptation in our domain. We've got some great blogs and resources. If you're interested in learning more about fire adapted communities, we actually have a new YouTube recording that's on our YouTube channel, and you can just find us by searching our name, Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network. We had a whole webinar on fire adaptation in action and what this looks like around the country. So if you want to hear more about the wildfire piece of our work, definitely feel free to connect with us on social media, or follow along with our blog. And now we'll save the last 5 minutes of the call for questions. And thank you again so much for having Michelle and I.
Great. Thank you so much, Emily and Michelle. That was super interesting. And I really love the ripple effect mapping. So yeah, I think we have time for a few questions. Does anyone have questions? Yes, Amanda.
Hi, thank you, Michelle and Emily. That was really great and super useful. I'm probably going to send you like an email later and try to pick your brains if that's okay. But I was wondering, since SPAN is also about to embark on creating a network visualization tool, probably very similar to the network visualization that you showed, I was just wondering, what tool did you use? And if you could do it again, would you use the same tool? And did you had the functionalities of it?
Yeah, so thanks, Amanda. For the 2018 SNA, our consultant used Gephi and taught us how to use Gephi for the visualization software. It is definitely pretty easy to use. Like, I didn't really know what I was doing, and he was able to teach me how to manipulate the maps. And so I would say it is pretty easy. The nice thing about it is that you can share the maps with people, and you can actually let people manipulate the maps themselves if they have accounts. The one downside was that it is a paid thing. And from what I remember, to keep the map private, it was actually kind of expensive. And so we had to kind of figure that out with our consultant. But we really liked Gephi, and I would definitely use it again. And I could get you some more, I know that's kind of a vague answer, but I have some more notes written down about Gephi I can share with you.